Before we begin, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories that expose the truth behind real crimes.
No one wakes up believing today will be the day their entire life collapses. Rita Pangalangan didn't either. That morning began like so many others, quiet, routine, almost forgettable. And yet, by the end of that day, one truth would surface that no parent should ever have to face. A truth so heavy, so unthinkable, that even saying it out loud feels wrong. This is not just a story about a child who died. It is a story about a mother who slowly came to understand that the danger was never outside the home. It was much closer than anyone imagined. To the people who knew her, Rita was an ordinary woman, a mother trying to hold things together, someone who worried about bills, about her child's future, about being good enough. There was nothing about her that screamed monster. In fact, that's what makes this case so disturbing, because when this story first broke, no one was looking at Rita with suspicion. They were looking at her with sympathy. Her daughter was her world, at least that's how it looked from the outside. Friends saw photos of birthdays, small celebrations, smiles that seemed real enough. Rita talked about being tired, stressed, overwhelmed, but what parent doesn't? To most people, she was just another struggling mother doing her best. And when tragedy struck, it appeared she had become another victim of cruel fate. The call for help came suddenly. Emergency responders were told a child was unresponsive. There was panic in Rita's voice. Real panic, the kind that makes people believe you instantly. When help arrived, the scene looked like every parent's nightmare. A young child, lifeless. A mother in shock. Tears, confusion, fear. Nothing about those first moments suggested a crime, let alone one so personal. At first, doctors and responders considered natural causes. Accidents happen. Children fall, they choke, they stop breathing. It's tragic, but it's not rare. Rita clung to that possibility because it was the only thing that made sense, because the alternative, that something else caused this, was unbearable. But grief has a strange way of opening doors people would rather keep closed. As hours passed, small details began to feel wrong. Not loud, dramatic red flags, just quiet inconsistencies. The kind that don't scream but whisper. A timeline that didn't fully add up. Injuries that didn't quite match the explanation. Statements that shifted slightly each time they were told. These were not things that immediately pointed to guilt. They were simply questions. And questions, once asked, don't go away. Investigators are trained to listen closely, not just to words, but to emotion. Rita cried yes, but grief is complex. People grieve differently. What mattered more was how her story changed, not drastically, but subtly. A minute here, a movement there. A detail remembered later that should have been obvious from the start. Each change, on its own, meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. At this stage, Rita was still seen as a grieving mother, and she was grieving. That part was real. But grief does not cancel responsibility. And, as the investigation deepened, the focus slowly began to shift inward, toward the home, toward the relationship between mother and child. Those who reviewed the family's past found stress, a lot of it. Financial pressure, emotional strain, long days with little support. Rita had reportedly expressed feeling overwhelmed more than once. She spoke about exhaustion, about losing patience, about feeling trapped. Again, nothing criminal, just human weakness. But in true crime, weakness is often where the story begins. People like to believe that parents who hurt their children are evil from the start, that they look different, act different, but most cases don't work that way. More often, they begin with frustration that grows quietly, with moments of anger that pass, with lines crossed slowly, then more often, until something breaks. As investigators looked closer, they began to ask a question that makes everyone uncomfortable. What happens when a parent loses control? Not forever, not even for long, just for a moment. Rita denied harming her daughter. She insisted she loved her. And those two things are not always opposites. That's one of the hardest truths in cases like this. Love does not always stop harm. Sometimes it exists right alongside it. Medical findings began to complicate the picture. Experts noted signs that didn't match a sudden accident. Again, not enough to accuse, but enough to raise serious concern. At this point, the investigation was no longer about what happened to the child. It was about how. Rita was asked to retell the events again and again. Each retelling took something from her. You could hear it in her voice. The confidence faded. Doubt crept in. Not doubt about the loss, but doubt about herself, about her memory, about that final stretch of time she couldn't fully explain. This is where this case takes a turn that sets it apart from so many others, because sometimes the most terrifying realization doesn't come from the police, it comes from within. As pressure mounted, Rita began to confront moments she had tried to push away, anger she didn't want to admit, actions she had minimized, not because she was lying, but because she couldn't accept what they meant. The human mind is powerful when it comes to self-protection. It hides truths that are too painful to face. But those truths don't disappear. They wait. In interviews, Rita's languagita began to speak less about what happened and more about how she felt, about being pushed beyond her limit, about being tired in a way sleep couldn't fix, about feeling like she was failing as a mother. These were not confessions, but they were cracks. And through those cracks, something darker began to show. The idea that this was an accident started to crumble, not because someone accused her outright, but because the story no longer held together. Rita herself struggled to hold on to it, and that struggle became impossible to hide. By the end of the first phase of the investigation, one thing was clear. This was not a simple tragedy. And Rita Pangalangan was no longer just a grieving mother. She was now the center of a question no one wanted to ask. Could a mother cause the death of her own child and only realize it afterward? In the next part, we'll dig deeper into the mounting evidence, the psychological pressure, and the moment when denial began to give way to something far more terrifying than accusation, understanding. Grief has a way of slowing time, but investigations do the opposite. They move forward whether the people involved are ready or not. For Rita Pangalangan, the days following her daughter's death felt unreal, like she was watching someone else's life fall apart. Yet, while she was drowning in loss, authorities were quietly reconstructing the final hours of her child's life, minute by minute, detail by detail. At first, Rita believed cooperation would bring clarity. She answered questions willingly. She repeated her account patiently. She trusted that once everything was explained, everyone would see what she saw, that this was a tragic accident. But what Rita didn't realize was that each retelling was being measured, not just for content, but for consistency. Investigators noticed that Rita's version of events stayed emotionally intense, but structurally unstable. The feelings were always there: panic, fear, heartbreak, but the order of events kept shifting. Sometimes the child had been fine earlier. Other times, she had been unusually quiet. Sometimes, Rita noticed something was wrong immediately. Other times, there was a delay she couldn't quite explain. None of this meant guilt on its own. Trauma scrambles memory. That's well known. But when investigators paired her statements with physical evidence, the gap between what was said and what was found began to widen. Medical experts were brought in to review the autopsy results more closely. The findings didn't scream murder, but they didn't whisper accident either. There were signs of force that were difficult to explain away, injuries that suggested more than a fall, more than a single moment of impact. The kind of findings that make professionals pause and reread the report. When Rita was informed that the cause of death was still under review, something shifted in her. Until that moment, she had been clinging to the idea that science would clear her name, that facts would protect her. Instead, the facts were now uncertain, and uncertainty is dangerous when guilt and innocence hang in the balance. Friends and family noticed changes too. Rita became withdrawn. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. She replayed moments aloud, questioning herself constantly. Did I check on her sooner? Did I miss something? These questions sounded like grief, but there was something else beneath them, a growing fear that the answers might not be comforting. Investigators began looking beyond the final day and into Rita's life as a whole. Parenting history, stress levels, support systems, patterns. They found a woman under pressure for a long time, financial strain, little help, long stretches alone with a child who needed constant attention. Rita had reportedly admitted to feeling overwhelmed more than once. She talked about feeling like she was failing, like she was losing control. Again, none of this made her a criminal, but it painted a picture of someone nearing a breaking point. People often imagine violent acts as explosive, sudden moments, but in many cases, they are the result of slow buildup. Stress that piles up quietly, anger that has nowhere to go, fatigue that turns patience into irritation, then into resentment. When that emotional pressure has no release, it doesn't disappear, it leaks out. During one interview, Rita was asked a simple question. Had she ever lost her temper with her daughter? Rita paused longer than expected. When she answered, she didn't say no. She said, "I tried my best." That answer lingered. As questioning continued, Rita's tone began to change. Early interviews were filled with certainty, later ones were filled with doubt. She stopped speaking in absolutes. Words like maybe, I think, and I don't remember exactly became common. The story wasn't just slipping for investigators, it was slipping for Rita herself. This is where denial starts to crack. Not because someone is accused, but because their own mind starts replaying moments they've avoided. The mind doesn't do this kindly. It brings fragments, sounds, feelings, physical sensations, not full memories, but enough to disturb sleep and shatter peace. Rita reportedly began having nightmares, waking up in panic, replaying arguments that felt small at the time, but now felt enormous. Moments when she raised her voice, when frustration took over, when she handled her daughter more roughly than she meant to. At first, she told herself these memories were exaggerations, fueled by guilt. Every grieving parent questions themselves. That's normal. But then came the memories she couldn't dismiss. Small flashes, her own hands, the sound of crying, the feeling of being pushed past patience into something sharper, something she didn't want to name. Investigators noticed the change too. Rita's body language shifted. She became tense when certain topics were raised. She avoided eye contact when discussing discipline, not because she was lying, but because she was afraid of where the truth might lead. At this stage, law enforcement didn't need a confession. They needed understanding. They needed to know whether Rita herself was starting to see what they were seeing. Because sometimes, the most powerful evidence is when a suspect begins to confront their own actions. The pressure intensified, not through aggression, but through silence, through long pauses, through letting Rita speak until she reached the edge of her own thoughts. And when she did, what came out was not a clear admission, but something far more revealing. She began to say things like, "I didn't mean to hurt her," and "I was just trying to make her stop." These statements weren't framed as crimes. They were framed as explanations, as justifications, as pleas to be understood. But intent doesn't erase outcome. This is the moment where many true crime stories split in two directions. Some suspects shut down completely. Others fight every accusation. Rita did neither. She unraveled slowly, painfully, as realization crept in. The hardest truth wasn't that her daughter was gone. It was that Rita could no longer be sure she hadn't caused it. And once that thought takes root, it changes everything. By the end of this phase of the investigation, the case was no longer just about forensic evidence or timelines. It had become a psychological unraveling. a mother confronting the possibility that the line between discipline and harm had been crossed, and that the crossing had consequences she could never undo. In the next part, we'll examine the turning point, the moment when Rita's internal battle collided with the investigation, and denial finally gave way to a realization that would haunt her forever. There is a point in every true crime case where facts stop being the most important thing, where evidence takes a back seat to something far more dangerous, the human mind. For Rita Pangalangan, that moment didn't arrive with handcuffs or accusations. It arrived quietly, in the spaces between questions, in the silence after answers, in the growing realization that the story she had been telling herself might not survive much longer. Up until this point, Rita had been fighting two battles at once, one with investigators and a much harder one with herself. On the outside, she was still a grieving mother trying to make sense of a terrible loss. On the inside, something was shifting. The certainty she once had, that this was an accident, that she was just unlucky, was slipping away. Investigators began to slow everything down. This is a tactic rarely understood by the public. When law enforcement senses that a person is close to the truth, they don't rush. They create space. They allow silence to do the work, and silence can be terrifying when your own thoughts are your worst enemy. Rita was asked to walk through the day again, not quickly, not emotionally, slowly, from the moment she woke up, what her daughter ate, what mood she was in, what irritated her, what didn't. At first, Rita answered mechanically, like she had done before, but then came the pauses, long ones, the kind where a person stops talking not because they don't know what to say, but because they're afraid of what might come out. She began to correct herself mid-sentence. She backtracked. She apologized for not remembering clearly. But memory wasn't the real issue anymore. What was happening was recognition. Her mind was lining up moments she had kept separate before. Moments of frustration, moments of yelling, moments where she felt disrespected by a child who didn't understand boundaries the way adults do. Rita spoke about feeling invisible, unheard, pushed past her limit. And as she spoke, something became clear. She wasn't describing a single bad moment. She was describing a pattern. This is where many viewers feel uncomfortable because it forces a difficult truth. Harm doesn't always come from hatred. Sometimes it comes from exhaustion, from pressure, from a person who doesn't have the tools to step away when they should. Rita began to talk about discipline, not proudly, not defensively, carefully. She explained how she believed in being firm, how she didn't want to raise a spoiled child, how sometimes raising her voice felt like the only way to be heard. These statements weren't shocking. Millions of parents would nod along. That's what made them dangerous. Then came the question that changed everything. Investigators asked her if there had ever been a moment where she felt she went too far. The room reportedly went quiet. Rita didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was different, softer, less certain. She didn't say no. She didn't say yes. She said, "I didn't think so at the time." That sentence carried more weight than any confession could have, because it acknowledged something critical. Her understanding of her actions had changed. From that point on, Rita stopped speaking like someone defending an accident. She began speaking like someone searching for a line and realizing she may have crossed it without noticing. She described a moment where her daughter wouldn't stop crying, where nothing worked, where Rita felt trapped inside her own anger. She didn't describe violence directly. She described emotion, overwhelm, loss of control, the kind of emotional flood that drowns logic. People watching from the outside often ask, how could someone not know? The answer is uncomfortable, because the brain is capable of minimizing harm when admitting it would destroy your identity. Rita didn't see herself as someone who could hurt her child, so when something happened that didn't fit that identity, her mind tried to soften it, rename it, shrink it. But the body doesn't lie the way the mind does. Medical findings were now being explained to her in plain language. What injuries meant, what they suggested, not accusations, explanations. And with each explanation, Rita's emotional defenses weakened. She started crying differently. Not loudly, not dramatically. Quietly. Like someone mourning something beyond loss. Like someone realizing that grief and guilt might be tangled together forever. At one point, she reportedly said something that investigators never forgot. "I keep seeing it differently now." That was the turning point. Not a confession, not a breakdown, a shift in perception. Rita began replaying the event not as something that happened to her, but something she was part of. She questioned her own actions aloud, asked if it was possible that what she thought was discipline had actually been harm, asked if the way she grabbed her daughter, the way she reacted in that moment, could have caused more damage than she ever intended. These were not questions someone asks if they believe they are innocent. This is where the title of this case truly begins to make sense. Because Rita wasn't confronted with the idea that she murdered her daughter by the police. She arrived at that possibility herself, slowly, painfully, piece by piece. And that realization is often more devastating than accusation. The human mind can survive being blamed by others. It struggles to survive blaming itself. Rita reportedly became physically ill during later interviews. She struggled to sit still. She covered her face. She repeated that she loved her daughter, over and over, as if saying it enough times could undo what she was beginning to understand. Love, however, doesn't erase consequences. By this stage, investigators no longer needed to push. Rita was unraveling on her own. Her statements became less about what happened and more about why. Why she was so angry. Why she didn't walk away. Why she didn't ask for help. Why she thought she could handle everything alone. Those whys haunted her. This wasn't a case of a cold, calculating killer. It was a case of a person confronting the worst version of themselves, a version they never believed existed. And that makes the story far more disturbing because it forces a question no one wants to ask. How thin is the line between being overwhelmed and being dangerous? As this realization settled in, the case shifted again. No longer just an investigation, it became a reckoning. For Rita, for everyone watching, for every parent who has ever felt pushed to the edge. Because the truth was no longer something outside of her. It was something she had to live with. And once that door opened, there was no closing it again. What followed would not just decide Rita Pangalangan's legal fate, but would define her forever. Grief is loud in the beginning. It crashes in waves, leaves people breathless, and demands attention. But guilt is quieter. It settles in slowly, like a weight on the chest that never fully lifts. By the time Rita Pangalangan reached this stage, her grief had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. It was no longer just about losing her daughter. It was about facing the possibility that the loss had come from her own hands. This shift didn't happen overnight. It crept in through sleepless nights and replayed memories, through moments when silence felt unbearable because it allowed thoughts to grow too loud. Rita reportedly stopped talking about the future entirely. She spoke only about the past, and even then, her words came carefully, as if every sentence carried the risk of breaking something fragile inside her. Investigators continued their work, but the tone had changed. There was less confrontation and more observation. They were watching someone process a truth in real time. Rita was no longer pushing back. She wasn't arguing timelines or defending her actions. Instead, she was questioning herself, constantly. She began to describe her emotions in ways she hadn't before. Not just tired, not just stressed, but angry. Angry at her situation, angry at herself, angry at how small things felt overwhelming. She admitted that there were moments when her daughter's crying felt unbearable, like it was closing in on her. These admissions weren't framed as excuses. They were confessions of weakness, And weakness, when left unchecked, can turn dangerous. Rita talked about control, or rather, the lack of it. She described feeling like everything in her life was slipping away: money, stability, identity. In that chaos, the only place she felt she could assert control was at home, over her environment, over routines, over her child's behavior. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths in cases like this. Control doesn't always look violent at first. It often starts as structure, rules, discipline, expectations. But when someone is emotionally overwhelmed, control can tighten too much, too fast. As Rita spoke, it became clear that she had been operating in survival mode for a long time. Not thinking, reacting, not choosing, exploding. And when you live that way long enough, you stop noticing when reactions cross into harm. The medical findings continued to loom in the background. Rita now listened to them differently. Where once she had searched for explanations that proved her innocence, she now searched for understanding. How much force is too much? How fragile is a child's body? How quickly can things go wrong? These were questions she asked with fear, not curiosity. At one point, Rita reportedly said, "I didn't know it could happen like that." That sentence revealed everything. It showed that she was no longer denying the possibility of her involvement. She was struggling with the reality that harm doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind normal moments and familiar actions. The emotional toll was visible. Rita lost weight. She appeared drained. Her voice lacked the energy it once had. Even her tears had changed. They were no longer bursts of grief. They were slow, constant, exhausted, the kind of crying that comes from resignation, not shock. This stage is often where people expect a dramatic confession, a breakdown, screaming, collapsing, but real life rarely follows that script. Instead, what happened was far more disturbing. Rita began speaking about her daughter in the past tense in a different way, not just acknowledging death, but acknowledging distance. She referred to her daughter as the one I hurt, not directly, but indirectly, through phrasing, through implication, through silence after certain sentences. Investigators noted that Rita no longer asked if she would be cleared. She asked what would happen next, not defensively, practically. That shift alone spoke volumes. Friends and family noticed it too. They described her as hollow, like someone already serving a sentence inside her own mind. She didn't try to justify herself. She didn't try to paint herself as a victim anymore. She simply looked defeated. This is where guilt becomes heavier than grief. Grief mourns what was lost. Guilt mourns what was done. Rita began expressing fear, not of prison, not of public judgment, but of living with herself. She reportedly said she didn't know how she could go on knowing her daughter's last moments might have been filled with fear because of her. That thought alone was enough to break her. This phase of the case forced investigators to confront another difficult reality. Punishment would not bring clarity. Answers wouldn't bring peace. There was no outcome where everyone walked away whole. The damage had already been done, and yet the legal system still had a role to play. As evidence solidified and psychological evaluations continued, the case moved closer to its next stage, one where accountability would be defined not just by law, but by public perception, where Rita would no longer be seen only as a grieving mother or a broken woman, but as someone who caused irreversible harm. The transformation was complete. Denial had faded. Confusion had given way to understanding, and understanding had given way to guilt. What remained was the question of consequence, because realizing what you've done doesn't undo it, and remorse doesn't erase responsibility. In the next phase of this story, the focus would shift from internal collapse to external judgment, from what Rita believed about herself to what the system and the world would decide she was, and that judgment would follow her for the rest of her life. There is a moment in every investigation when the emotional story collides with the legal one. For Rita Pangalangan, that moment arrived quietly, without handcuffs or raised voices. It arrived through paperwork, formal language, and a shift in how people spoke to her. She was no longer being treated only as a grieving parent. She was now being treated as a suspect. This transition is often subtle but devastating. The room feels colder. Questions become more precise. Words are chosen carefully. Rita felt it immediately. The empathy didn't disappear, but it was now paired with distance. Professional distance. The kind that signals something serious is coming. By this point, investigators had gathered enough information to move forward. Medical findings, psychological observations, and Rita's own statements had created a picture that could no longer be ignored. It wasn't a story of deliberate cruelty, it was a story of loss of control, and in the eyes of the law, the outcome mattered more than the intent. Rita was informed that the case would be reviewed for criminal responsibility. This wasn't an arrest, it was a notice. But the weight of it was crushing. For the first time, the possibility of legal consequences became real, not abstract, not distant, but immediate. She didn't react with anger. She didn't argue. According to those present, she simply nodded, as if part of her had been expecting this moment, as if the internal judgment she had already passed on herself had prepared her for what was coming. Psychological evaluations became central to the case. Experts were tasked with understanding Rita's mental state at the time of her daughter's death. Was she aware of her actions? Did she understand the risk? Was there intent? These questions aren't just legal, they are deeply human. And answering them meant reopening wounds Rita was barely holding together. During evaluations, Rita spoke openly about her struggles. She described feeling overwhelmed to the point of emotional numbness. She admitted that in the moment she wasn't thinking about consequences. She was thinking about making the situation stop. That honesty was critical, but it was also damning. Because in the legal system, saying "I didn't mean to" doesn't remove responsibility. The narrative of the case began to shift publicly as well. Information leaked, rumors spread. People who had once expressed sympathy began asking uncomfortable questions. Online discussions grew harsher. The same society that mourns victims often demands villains, and Rita was slowly being placed into that role. This public shift added another layer of pressure. Rita wasn't just confronting her own guilt anymore. She was confronting the way the world now saw her, a woman who had failed in the most fundamental role society assigns, protecting her child. She reportedly avoided media, avoided mirrors, avoided conversations that might force her to explain herself. Because how do you explain something you barely understand yourself? Legally, the case moved forward with caution. Prosecutors weighed the evidence carefully. This was not a case they could present as black and white. There was no history of abuse, no pattern of intentional harm, but there was negligence, there was recklessness, and there was a death. Those facts couldn't be ignored. Rita was eventually informed of the charges being considered. The words sounded unreal when spoken aloud. Criminal negligence, manslaughter, legal terms that felt disconnected from the reality of her life. But they carried weight. They carried years. They carried consequences that would extend far beyond a courtroom. Her reaction wasn't dramatic. She didn't cry. She didn't protest. She simply asked one question. Does it change what happened? It didn't. That question revealed how far she had traveled emotionally. She was no longer focused on herself. She was focused on the permanence of her actions, on the fact that no outcome, no sentence, no punishment would bring her daughter back. As preparations for court began, Rita's life narrowed. Days were filled with meetings, evaluations, legal explanations. Nights were filled with silence. She reportedly struggled with suicidal thoughts, not from fear of prison, but from the weight of knowing she was responsible for something unforgivable. Support was limited. Some family members stood by her, others couldn't. Friends disappeared. Sympathy has limits, especially when children are involved. Rita learned that quickly. This stage of the story is uncomfortable because it resists simple labels. Rita was not a monster, but she was not innocent. She was a mother who lost control, and that loss of control cost a life. And the legal system does not deal in almost or never meant to. It deals in outcomes. As the case moved toward court, one truth became unavoidable. Rita would be defined not by who she believed herself to be, but by what she had done in her worst moment. The question now was no longer whether she realized her role in her daughter's death. She did. The question was what the world would do with that realization, and what would happen when grief, guilt, and law finally collided in a courtroom. Courtrooms have a strange way of stripping emotion down to its bare bones. Pain is translated into documents. Memories become evidence, and lives are reduced to timelines and charges. When Rita Pangalangan entered this phase, she wasn't just facing a judge or prosecutors. She was facing the final public version of a story she had spent months trying to survive. By the time the case reached court, Rita no longer resembled the woman people had first seen on the day her daughter died. The shock was gone. The denial was gone. What remained was a quiet, heavy presence, someone who looked like they were carrying something too large to put down. The prosecution's task was delicate. They weren't presenting a villain. They were presenting a failure of judgment, a failure to step away, a failure to protect. Their argument was simple but devastating. Regardless of intent, Rita's actions led to her child's death, and the law demanded accountability. They laid out the timeline carefully, not dramatically, methodically. They explained the medical findings in clear, simple language. They highlighted moments where intervention could have changed the outcome, moments where an adult's responsibility should have overridden emotion. There was no shouting, no graphic detail, and somehow that made it worse. The defense focused on context, on Rita's mental state, on exhaustion, stress, and lack of support. They emphasized that this was not a case of hatred or cruelty. It was a case of collapse, of a person reaching a breaking point and making a terrible mistake. Both sides were telling the truth. That's what made the case so hard. Rita listened to everything. She didn't avert her eyes. She didn't react visibly. When her daughter's name was spoken, her hands tightened. When details of the injuries were described, her breathing changed, but she remained silent, as if she had already accepted whatever was coming. When it was time for Rita to speak, the room shifted. Not because people expected a defense, but because they expected honesty, and that's what they got. She didn't deny what happened. She didn't blame anyone else. She spoke about love, yes, but she also spoke about failure, about losing control, about thinking she could handle everything on her own and being wrong. Her words weren't polished. They weren't strategic. They were raw. She acknowledged that her daughter trusted her, and that she broke that trust. That sentence alone carried more weight than any legal argument. People in the courtroom reportedly cried, not out of sympathy alone, but out of discomfort, because this wasn't a story of good versus evil. It was a story of consequences. The judge listened carefully. Judges in cases like this walk a difficult line. They must consider punishment, but also understanding, mercy, but also responsibility, and most importantly, the life that was lost. In the end, the ruling reflected that balance. Rita was held legally responsible. The court recognized the harm caused by her actions, but it also acknowledged the absence of malice and the presence of remorse. The sentence was serious, but not maximal. It carried years, not just in prison, but in stigma, in loss of freedom, in a life forever marked by one moment. When the sentence was read, Rita didn't collapse. She closed her eyes, as if sealing something inside herself. She did not look relieved. She did not look surprised. She looked resigned. Justice in this case did not feel like victory. It felt like finality. Outside the courtroom, public opinion remained divided. Some believed the sentence was too light. Others believed no punishment could ever be enough. And some believed that Rita was being punished every day simply by living with what she had done. All of those perspectives existed at once. For Rita, the courtroom chapter ended, but the consequences did not. Prison would take her freedom. Public judgment would take her identity. But nothing would ever take away the memory of that day. The legal system had spoken, but the deeper sentence, the one inside her, had already been passed long before the judge ever spoke. And as Rita was led away, one truth lingered in the silence she left behind. This case was never just about a crime. It was about what happens when ordinary people reach extraordinary limits, and what it costs when they do. In the next phase of this story, we'll look beyond the courtroom, into the aftermath, into the life that followed the verdict, and the long shadow this case would cast over everyone it touched. A verdict may close a case, but it does not close a story. When Rita Pangalangan was taken away after sentencing, the courtroom emptied, the headlines faded, and the public moved on. But for Rita, life was only beginning in its most stripped-down form. This was the part no cameras followed, the part where consequences stopped being theoretical and became daily reality. Prison life is designed to erase individuality. Names are replaced with numbers. Privacy disappears. Time stretches in uncomfortable ways. For someone like Rita, the shock wasn't just the loss of freedom. It was the silence. The kind of silence that leaves you alone with your thoughts for hours at a time. At first, she struggled to function. Routine felt pointless. Sleep came in short bursts. Nights were the hardest. There was nothing to distract her from memory. Every sound reminded her of what she no longer had. Every quiet moment replayed the same questions, the same regret, the same image of a child who would never grow up. Unlike many inmates, Rita wasn't angry at the system. She wasn't focused on appeals or blame. Her punishment had already been accepted emotionally long before it became physical. What she struggled with was identity. Who was she now? She was no longer a mother in the way she once understood it. She was no longer just a woman who made a mistake. She was officially labeled as someone who caused a child's death. That label followed her everywhere. In files, in whispers, in how others looked at her when they learned why she was there. Some inmates avoided her. Crimes involving children carry a heavy stigma, even inside prison walls. Others showed unexpected kindness, not forgiveness, but recognition. Many had their own stories of losing control, of moments that changed everything. Rita reportedly kept to herself. She followed rules. She didn't draw attention. She wasn't trying to disappear, but she wasn't trying to be seen either. She attended counseling sessions when offered, not because she thought they would fix anything, but because she needed a place where the truth could exist without judgment. Therapy forced Rita to confront things she had spent a lifetime avoiding: her relationship with stress, her inability to ask for help, her belief that strength meant endurance, even when it was destroying her. These realizations came too late to change the outcome, but they shaped how she lived with it. One of the hardest moments, reportedly, came during a group session focused on loss. Listening to others talk about losing loved ones reopened wounds Rita never got the chance to heal properly. Her grief had been interrupted by guilt, by arrest, by trial. Only now did it surface fully, and it was overwhelming. She spoke about her daughter carefully. She didn't glorify herself. She didn't minimize what happened. She spoke about love, about regret, and about how she wished someone had stepped in before things reached that point. Not to excuse her actions, but to prevent them. That distinction mattered to her. Outside prison walls, the world continued to debate her case. Some saw her as a cautionary tale, others as an unforgivable offender. Online discussions resurfaced occasionally, often lacking nuance. Rita didn't see most of it. but she felt its impact in the absence of support, in the silence from people who once knew her. Family connections were complicated. Some relationships survived, others didn't. Forgiveness, when it came at all, came slowly. Not everyone was ready to face her, and she understood why. Rita never asked to be understood publicly. She didn't seek sympathy. She reportedly said she didn't deserve it. What she wanted was meaning. Some way for her daughter's life and death to matter beyond a case file. That desire led her to participate in parenting awareness programs within the prison system. She didn't position herself as an expert. She positioned herself as a warning. Someone who spoke honestly about how stress, isolation, and unchecked emotion can lead to irreversible harm. These sessions weren't redemptive in the traditional sense. They didn't erase the past, but they gave Rita a fragile sense of purpose, a way to ensure that her story might stop someone else before they crossed the same line. This is where many true crime stories end, with a sentence, with a cell door closing, but the aftermath matters just as much, because it shows what accountability actually looks like, not just punishment, but lifelong responsibility. Rita's days became repetitive. Wake up, eat, work, think, remember. The structure kept her grounded, but it couldn't protect her from the weight she carried. She marked her daughter's birthdays quietly, privately, without ceremony. She didn't speak about release dates or future plans. Her sense of time was different now. The future felt abstract. The past felt constant. The verdict had taken her freedom, but memory had taken everything else. In the next part of this story, we'll step back and examine the wider impact of this case, what it revealed about parenting pressure, mental health, and the dangerous myth that love alone is enough to keep everyone safe. Some cases refuse to stay contained within courtrooms and prison walls. They spill outward, forcing uncomfortable conversations that society would rather avoid. The case of Rita Pangalangan became one of those stories, not because it was sensational, but because it was disturbingly relatable. Once the initial outrage faded, what remained were questions. Quiet ones, difficult ones, the kind that don't have clean answers. People began asking how something like this could happen without anyone stepping in sooner. Rita wasn't hiding in the shadows. She wasn't isolated by choice. She was part of a system, family, community, social services that saw stress but didn't intervene, or didn't know how. This case exposed a dangerous myth, that love automatically prevents harm, that good intentions are enough. But love, when paired with exhaustion and isolation, doesn't always protect. Sometimes it blinds. Parenting pressure played a major role in how this story unfolded. Rita felt she had to handle everything on her own. To admit struggle felt like failure, and that belief is not uncommon. Many parents are taught to endure silently, to push through, to see asking for help as weakness. That mindset can be deadly. Mental health professionals pointed out that Rita showed signs of chronic stress long before the tragedy. Emotional overload, lack of coping tools, burnout. These aren't dramatic warning signs. They're everyday realities for many caregivers, and that's what makes them dangerous when ignored. The case also raised questions about discipline culture. Where is the line between firmness and harm, between control and abuse? These lines are often taught differently across cultures, generations, and households. What one person sees as normal discipline, another sees as violence. Rita herself struggled with these definitions. She believed she was correcting behavior, not causing harm. But belief does not change impact, and children, especially young ones, are far more vulnerable than many adults realize. Public reaction reflected this tension. Some viewers reacted with anger, insisting there was no excuse. Others reacted with fear, seeing parts of themselves in Rita's stress, if not her actions. That fear made people uncomfortable, and discomfort often turns into judgment. But this case demanded more than judgment. It demanded reflection. Advocates began using the story to talk about early intervention, about recognizing caregiver burnout, about building systems that don't wait until tragedy forces attention. They argued that prevention requires listening to complaints that don't sound extreme, complaints about being tired, overwhelmed, alone, because those are often the first cracks. The legal outcome also sparked debate. Some felt the sentence was too lenient, others felt it was too harsh. But both sides agreed on one thing: no punishment could equal the loss of a child, and no ruling could fully address the complexity of what happened. This case didn't fit the mold of a typical crime story. There was no villain hiding in plain sight, no evil mastermind, just a person who reached a breaking point without realizing how fragile the situation truly was. That reality scared people more than a clear-cut monster ever could. For parents watching, the story lingered. It forced them to confront moments they'd brushed off, times they lost patience, times they raised their voice, times they felt on the edge. It raised the uncomfortable idea that harm doesn't require hatred. It only requires loss of control, and that loss can happen faster than anyone expects. The media eventually moved on. New stories replaced old ones. But within professional circles, social workers, therapists, child welfare advocates, the case continued to be referenced, not as an anomaly, but as a warning. A warning about silence, a warning about stigma, a warning about what happens when people feel they must suffer alone. Rita's story became less about her as an individual and more about what she represented. A mirror held up to a society that often ignores the emotional cost of caregiving until it's too late. This doesn't lessen responsibility. It doesn't excuse harm, but it broadens understanding. And understanding is where prevention begins. As we move toward the end of this story, one question remains. What are we supposed to do with cases like this? Because forgetting them ensures repetition, and simplifying them ensures we learn nothing. In the final parts, we'll reflect on the lasting legacy of this case and the lesson it leaves behind for anyone willing to look honestly at it. Some stories don't end with lessons or closure. They end with memory, heavy, permanent, and impossible to set down. By the time the case of Rita Pangalangan reached this stage, there were no more legal developments, no new evidence, no appeals that changed the outcome. What remained was something far more enduring: the human cost that continued long after the world stopped paying attention. For Rita, memory became her constant companion. Prison routines could structure her days, but they couldn't quiet her mind. Every ordinary moment carried echoes of the past: a child's laugh in the distance, a toy left behind in someone else's visiting room, a calendar date she could never ignore. She didn't try to push these memories away anymore. Early on, she had learned that avoidance only made them louder. Instead, she carried them, not as punishment, but as responsibility. She reportedly said that forgetting would be the cruelest thing she could do, not to herself, but to her daughter. This mindset shaped how she lived her sentence. Rita kept journals, not to justify herself, but to document her thoughts honestly. She wrote about small things, weather, conversations, emotions, but always circled back to the same truth: that one moment of loss of control had defined everything that came after. Writing became a way to keep that truth visible, even when it hurt. Counselors noted that Rita never framed herself as a victim. She spoke about pain, yes, but never injustice. She didn't claim the system failed her. She claimed she failed her child. That distinction mattered, especially in a place where blame often becomes a shield. At the same time, the case continued to live in public memory in a different way. Online, it resurfaced occasionally through discussions, reaction videos, and comment sections filled with arguments. Some people reduced the story to headlines. Others debated morality and absolutes. Very few acknowledged the full complexity. And complexity is uncomfortable. It's easier to label someone evil than to admit that ordinary stress, unchecked emotion, and isolation can create conditions for tragedy. But cases like this refuse simple labels. They sit in the gray space where responsibility and humanity collide. For those who followed the case closely, the daughter's absence became the most powerful presence of all. She existed only through descriptions now, through memories others shared, through what might have been. Her life was short, but the impact of her death was wide and lasting. Some advocates pushed for memorial efforts, not grand monuments, but quiet reminders, parenting resources, awareness campaigns, conversations that acknowledged how easily stress can turn dangerous if ignored. These efforts didn't center Rita. They centered prevention. That distinction mattered too. Inside prison, Rita aged differently than the years suggested. Grief has a way of doing that. She didn't talk about release with hope or fear. She spoke about it as something abstract, something that might happen but would never truly free her. Freedom, to her, had been lost long before sentencing. She understood that even if she walked outside again one day, she would never escape the identity this case had given her. She would always be the mother who caused her child's death. Not in headlines, but in her own mind, and she accepted that as part of her accountability. This acceptance didn't bring peace, but it brought clarity. Clarity that what happened could never be undone. Clarity that love alone is not protection. Clarity that asking for help is not weakness, it's necessity. These realizations came too late to change her story, but not too late to influence others. That, more than anything, became the quiet legacy of this case. Because memory, when used honestly, can be a warning. As this story approaches its end, there is no dramatic twist waiting. No hidden truth yet to be revealed. Only reflection. And a final question that lingers long after the details fade. What do we do with stories that don't let us feel comfortable? In the final part, we'll bring everything together. Not to judge, not to excuse, but to sit with the truth of what this case tells us about responsibility, vulnerability, and the cost of silence. Every true crime story ends somewhere, but not all endings offer relief. Some leave us unsettled, forcing us to sit with questions we would rather ignore. The case of Rita Pangalangan is one of those stories. There is no neat conclusion, no sense that justice restored balance. What remains is a hard truth about how fragile that balance is to begin with. At its core, this case was never just about a crime. It was about a line, thin, invisible, and far easier to cross than most people want to believe. The line between patience and frustration, between discipline and harm, between love and control. Rita didn't wake up one day intending to destroy her life or end her child's. She crossed that line without recognizing it in the moment, and by the time she did, it was already too late. That reality makes this story deeply uncomfortable, because it challenges the idea that danger always looks dangerous. Sometimes it looks like exhaustion, like isolation, like someone telling themselves they can handle just one more day without help. And society often encourages that mindset, praising endurance while ignoring warning signs. Rita's story forces us to confront the cost of that silence. Accountability mattered in this case. A child lost her life, and that loss demanded responsibility. The legal system did what it was designed to do. It recognized harm and imposed consequences. But accountability does not erase tragedy. It only names it. What happened to Rita after the verdict matters, but what matters more is what happens beyond her. The conversations this case sparked, the awareness it created, the way it forced people to examine their own limits. Because the truth is, no one is immune to breaking points, and pretending otherwise doesn't make us safer, it makes us vulnerable. This case also reminds us that remorse, no matter how real, does not undo harm. Rita lives with that truth every day, not as a symbol, not as a lesson, but as a person who must carry the weight of what she did for the rest of her life. There is no redemption arc here, no moment where everything feels resolved. And that's important. Stories like this are often simplified into villains and victims, but real life doesn't work that way. Real life is messier, pain overlaps, responsibility and humanity exist in the same space. The only thing that can come from that mess is awareness. Awareness that parents need support before they reach the edge. Awareness that asking for help should never feel shameful. Awareness that love, without control and understanding, is not enough. The daughter at the center of this story never got the chance to grow up, to make choices, to live beyond the moment that ended her life. Honoring her doesn't mean turning away from the truth. It means facing it fully, even when it hurts. Because forgetting stories like this doesn't protect us. Learning from them might. And that is where this story truly ends. Not with closure, but with responsibility. Responsibility to recognize our limits. Responsibility to speak up before silence becomes danger. Responsibility to never assume we are incapable of crossing a line, because that assumption is often where the line disappears. Thank you for staying with this story until the end.